Welcome to CoramBAAF Conversations, a podcast series dedicated to adoption, fostering and kinship care. We ask children's social care professionals and experts by experience to join us to share with us and you, our listeners, their experiences, reflections and knowledge. I hope you enjoy.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Anne Horne, CoramBAAF's Kinship Consultant. This podcast episode is being recorded as part of CoramBAAF's Members Week, which is a yearly event for CoramBAAF members. The focus of our week this week is listening to the child. And each day we'll be exploring a different theme relating to the diverse experiences and challenges faced by children and young people who are adopted, who are living in foster care or growing up in kinship care. If you want more information, visit our website, corambaaf.org.uk. Our focus today is on listening to the child through exploring and supporting the identity of children and young people. I'm really excited to introduce and have a conversation with Sariya Cheruvallil-Contractor. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Anne. It's fabulous to be here. I am professor in the Sociology of Religion at Coventry University. I work in a Peace Studies Center, and all of our work is about, making the earth a more peaceful place. Now, peace is not just about the absence of war. It is also about creating environments where we look out for each other. And that is really how I've, arrived here at this conversation with you. How can we better address the needs of children in care? And as you said, today we'll be talking about identity.
Thank you. So your research includes quite a wide variety of information, doesn't it, in sort of key findings?
Yeah.
Where did your interest in identity, sort of as a sociologist and sort of feminist researcher, come from? Where did that sort of originate from?
A long time ago, almost a decade ago now, I decided I was going to do a PhD. I say decided, but it all sort of happened. And my PhD ended up being a feminist giving of voice to Muslim women. And I realized when you talk about Muslim women in Britain, there are lots of different people back then and even today talking about them, talking for them. And I felt it was really important for the Muslim woman to speak for herself. That was the premise of the PhD. But, as academics, it's all about theoretical framing, all of that jazz. And as I was delving into Muslim women's stories, as I was talking to them, I realized that they were all so different. And that's really first where I started thinking about identity. I came across the work of a Black theorist, a Black academic called Stuart Hall. And he wrote a lot about culture. He wrote a lot about Black identity. He wrote a lot about British identity. And I remember this quote from him, where he talks about how, we are sometimes labeled as such and such, Muslim woman, care experienced young person, and you can, whatever label you want in between. But what he also said is it's not quite true. These labels are often a single story, to draw on the Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi. These are single stories because, just look at my own identity. In addition to being perhaps a visible Muslim woman, a sociologist of religion, I am also of Indian heritage. I am also female. I am also an academic. I have a faith. And all of these things, these different things, some that I can think of today, some that I cannot, come together to form who we are. And I think the thrust of my work in relation to identity is to get other academics like me, but also policymakers, frontline social workers, everybody really, to think about identity not as something that is singular, but as something that is layered and nuanced. I was listening to a piece of music today and I thought about texture. Our identities have so much happening within them. And that's really what I want us to think about in relation to children in care as well. They've got the child in care label or care experienced adult or whatever, but there's so much more to these children, to these young people than just that.
I think that's such a helpful sort of starting concept, isn't it? That it's not just a single story, and that we're all more than just a single story. And so do you think that's sort of one of the key concepts from your research that is sort of most important for sort of practitioners to sort of think about? Or do you think there are sort of other key concepts that sort of lead on from that, that it's important for practitioners to kind of hold on to when we're thinking about kind of the identity of children and young people?
Yeah. So, I mean, just to, say a couple of sentences, a bit of background about the research. A few years ago, I was given a pot of funding from the charity Penny Appeal and the Department for Education. And they asked us to do a piece of research around Muslim heritage children, Muslim children in care. So forget about the heritage bit. I was delighted to do the work. I personally would have liked a wider label, if we stay with that term for now. But they said, go and look at the journeys of Muslim children in care. Now, very quickly, I realized that this Muslim label, wasn't sufficient. There were, and we were talking about texture. There were children who had Muslim names, and Muslim backgrounds, and I can think about one of the stories I heard. This was Mansoor and his siblings. They had come into care after their parents went from, being not very Muslim at all. They drank alcohol, they had the drugs, they were quite antisocial. So from that kind of behavior, they went to becoming, really super devout Muslims. And forgive me, these are generalizations, but this is how, it makes it easier to talk about these complexities. And suddenly their parents were praying more than 5 times a day. Suddenly they went from not very modest clothing to like super modest clothing, and the children struggled. They couldn't cope with this newfound practice of their parents. Um, they often faced corporal punishment because they didn't conform to their parents' beliefs, and social workers had to take them into care after working with the family for almost 6 months. Now, these children, when they came into care, they wanted nothing to do with Islam. They were so damaged by what they had encountered in their biological home. They wanted nothing to do with faith. They demanded things like beer and ham, because that was how they thought they could reject their faith. Um, but they had Muslim names, and so what we mustn't do is make assumptions. I have encountered, other children and young people for whom faith has been the front all and be all of their identity. The upheavals that coming into care, that are part of coming into care. But in all of those upheavals, in that living out of a suitcase kind of mode, not having biological family, children have told me how they have found solace from their faith, where they have drawn courage and resilience from their faith. So it comes, the picture is quite complicated. Other children who have struggled to settle down, who've been branded all sorts of, negative things, including troublemakers, badly behaved, have settled down when they have moved into a foster carer who had either a shared faith or a shared ethnic identity. So, in thinking about, identity and in working with professionals, so these might be social workers, decision makers, policy makers, and also in working with carers, whether they are foster carers, they're adopters, there are others, we've, rather than go and look at a child as somebody who fits into a category, what the whole thrust of my work is instead to say that, go and ask the child, be curious about what matters to them, what is their authentic self. Is it that their gender matters more to them, or is it that their faith matters, or is it that their ethnicity matters? Ask the child, and then any care plans, any decisions need to foster that child's sense of self. Sometimes this is brilliant for the child, and sometimes as responsible adults, you foster a child's identity, For example, Mansour, who was rejecting his faith, you support the child in this moment. That is what they need. Support them, but also perhaps leave breadcrumbs in life story work, etc., so that they can find who they were if they ever so will it.
Because I noticed at the beginning when you talked about Muslim heritage children, and then you said, oh, but actually the research, what I was asked to do was work with Muslim children, but I know that you prefer the term Muslim heritage children, don't you? Do you want to just talk a little bit about that? Because I think that makes an interesting point.
Yes, and I was hoping, thanks for asking me that question. And so absolutely, when we started the work, the funding, the scope was about Muslim children. But as soon as we started doing the work, as soon as we started talking to people who cared for quote unquote Muslim children, we realized that there was so much more texture. Children's Muslimness is predicated on the kind of environments that they have had prior to coming into care. I spoke to a young woman. She was in care since the age of 11, and she spoke to me about when she was with her biological family, everything she did was from the lens of her faith. Even the songs she sang were faith-based songs. And to her, at least early on in care, all of her identity was determined by her faith. But this same child, and she spoke to me, when she was about 13, she managed to organize a trip to the pilgrimage city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. She says, there I held the Kaaba, which is the little black box that you see in images of Mecca, that Muslims believe that Adam laid the foundations, Abraham built it. So there's a long, theological significance. But she held it and she wept tears of joy. She was so spiritually moved. Right? So that was this young woman's reality when she, right through to the age of 13. Now, I interviewed her when she was about 15. And she said, can I say something to you? I'm like, yeah. Is your work about Muslim children? And I'm like, not really, no. I'm talking about minoritized children of different ethnic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, or none. And she said, okay, that's fine then, because I'm no longer religious. The whole Muslim heritage thing is about capturing this complexity that identity moves, peaks and troughs, different points on a board, but whatever metaphor you want to use. Your religiosity is also determined by your ethnicity. So a black Christian's experience of worship is very different from a white Church of England Anglican Christian's experience of worship, whereas one is formal, is structured. The other experience of the same sort of worship, the same faith, is much more musical. There's a lot more movement and dancing and whatever. And so the whole focus on heritage is to say, look, religious identity, ethnic identity could be a point on a continuum rather than a set idea. Let me give you another example. So another young woman I spoke to, Black woman, she'd been adopted since birth by a white family. And she says, all my life, I thought of myself as white. My skin was darker than my parents, but I thought of myself as white. That was who I was. And she never thought, years later, she encountered Black culture as an adult, as a young adult. She'd gone for a work due to Hackney and encountered a version of Black culture there. And it completely threw her. She couldn't make sense of who she was anymore. She was briefly estranged from her adoptive family. It's all hunky-dory now. And that's where my Muslim heritage, my preference for the term Muslim heritage over Muslim comes from. Points on a continuum in terms of religiosity, deeply religious to not very religious at all. There could be ethnic variations. Even the food we eat, you might have two Muslims from Indonesia, say, and of Indian heritage, and the food they eat, the clothes they wear, the language they speak is going to be very different. But they're both Muslim. And using the term heritage, we feel, just allows for that space. Saying that though, Anne, recently it has also occurred to me, and this is through work with frontline social workers. While the term Muslim heritage is good for planning, thinking, writing up reports and whatnot, but when you are working with children, when you are talking to them, again, find out from them what and how they would like to be described. So they might not like Muslim heritage because they've never encountered the term. So yeah, it's about curiosity.
That phrase, it allows for space, because then within that space, you can have the curiosity. But if you don't allow for the space, then you're going to go straight to a much more sort of fixed understanding, aren't you? That my fixed understanding of what it means to be a Muslim is X, Y, and Z. And it doesn't allow you to step back and have that curious space to kind of explore what does it mean for that child or young person.
Yeah.
And I think that possibly, and this might be going a bit off topic, but kind of relates as well to the distinction between kind of cultural competence and cultural humility, because cultural competence might suggest I have some knowledge about the Muslim faith and therefore this child is Muslim and therefore X, Y, and Z. Whereas actually, if you come from a kind of place of cultural humility, you're much more allowing that space, aren't you? And sort of learning from the child or the young person about what that culture or ethnicity or religion means to them.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And so, me and my colleagues, Alison Scott Bowman, Kusha Anand, Alison Halford, we've been delivering training workshops to social workers across the country. We started with workshops on Muslim heritage children in care, and now it's sort of widened. We've had funding from the Nuffield Foundation to talk to children about identity. We spoke to Black and South Asian children. So, it's widened. It's no longer just about Muslim children. But in doing these workshops, we're often asked, so, can you do something about Islam? Or can you do something about Blackness or whiteness or whateverness? And we always say, we're going to tell you lots of things. We're going to talk, we're going to have conversations, but we're not going to tell you what Islam is, because there's no one meaning of it. We're not going to tell you what Blackness is, because Blackness could mean something completely different. It would be completely different for somebody who is of Black African heritage, Black Caribbean heritage. There are completely different migration patterns, histories, trajectories, which have an enduring impact on class and where these communities are in the UK today. Blackness could mean something, if somebody has a first generation migrant, their idea of Blackness is going to be very different from somebody who is third, fourth generation, who's lived their life here, who are as British as can be. And so practicing humility, it's yes, do by all means equip yourself, by all means go and read and find out, equip yourself with the basic narrative. I was going to say facts, but I said basic narrative around these labels. But humility is what is key here, because every single person you speak to, every single family you're going to be working with is going to have their own perspective on things, their own way of doing things. When I'm with social workers, I often say I'm going to make your job harder, because we're not going to be able to give you answers. Instead, we're going to go and seek them out for yourself. But what ends up happening in these workshops is also that the people who the social workers who've attended, others, they feel a bit more empowered. And I think when it comes to questions of identity, particularly minoritized identity, and with the workforce being largely white, there are concerns. Am I going to offend by asking a particular question? Am I going to be politically incorrect? Am I going to inadvertently be a little racist? And we say our answer to that is, cultural humility is fabulous, and it empowers you to ask the questions that you need asking, because finding a family, assessing the needs for a Black child or a Muslim child is no different from assessing the needs of a white child. You have got to ask the questions that you've got to ask, full stop. But when it comes to a Black child or a Muslim child, just be prepared that some of the answers you get in return might surprise you, might flummox you, and then take those answers and judge them in their own right. I'm wondering whether I should give you a little story here. Let me give you a quick story, Anne. So, a social worker told us she was assessing this Muslim couple. They wanted to adopt. They were in their mid-30s, and she said, I asked them about, where have you lived? Address, and, with whom have you lived? So, sort of a little map of that, which is standard in adoption assessments. And she says, they said that both of them separately, they lived with their respective parents till such time as they got married, which was around the age of 28, and then they lived together. And she said she was a bit thrown by that. Were they hiding facts? They can't have lived with their parents till the age of 28. And she was quite she was concerned. Are they hiding facts? What's happening here? And I often pose this as a case study when I'm doing training programs, and the answers we get are amazing. So a South Asian heritage social worker told us, maybe she needs to stop thinking about relationships and where you live from a Eurocentric lens. For lots of South Asian families, there's no sex before marriage, no relationships. So you live with your parents, that's the done thing. And then you live with your spouse, you move in together. Sometimes your spouse, especially if you're a boy, you might continue living with your family, and your spouse moves into, and you have a big joint home with 3 or 4 generations living together. That still does happen. I've seen massive homes, sort of outskirts of the city, where you've got 3 generations of big South Asian families. So that was one answer. The other answer, some other social workers have said, it may well be that they've been in relationships before their marriage, but they don't feel comfortable talking about it in front of their spouse, because that's not a socially appropriate thing to do. And in that case, it may well be that the woman, because women's choices across all cultures are scrutinized a lot more. It may be harder for the woman, and it's about creating perhaps separate spaces, individual spaces where they can be more transparent. So I don't know where we started with this one, but yes, cultural humility is recognizing that your own lens, your own worldview is, first of all, knowing what your own worldview is, recognizing your own identity, recognizing your own position on social hierarchies. Are you an authoritative social worker with power assessing a couple here for whatever? Where do you stand? What authority do you have? What power do you have or not have? And then also realizing that your own worldview is not the only worldview, and being curious about everybody else's ways of doing things.
And that, in a way, does make me think then about foster carers and adopters and kinship carers who are caring for children. And, obviously, well, not, we try and, match children. So they might be being brought up in, similarly sort of similar culture or religions. But like you say, because of the textures, then obviously what does that, what does matching mean? Because you've got so many layers and textures. And so when I think about carers, and as you were saying, this sort of fear of social workers have it as well, that fear of sort of getting it wrong and saying the wrong thing. What would be your advice to carers, and therefore also to social workers to support carers, to kind of to enable those conversations about identity and what that means to children to kind of continue? Because it's not also just a one-stop conversation, is it? It's not just, oh, tick, I've done that. Sort of what advice would you give to kind of carers to so that they don't worry about getting it wrong, but just to kind of keep the conversation going?
Let me start with a story on this one. So I interviewed a young Black woman. I'm going to call her Rose. That's not her real name. And she spoke about being in care for a long, long time. She spoke about being in homes that completely matched well, on paper matched her ethnic and religious needs. So she spoke to me about, she was Black herself, and she spoke about being in a Black Muslim home. And she says, I was, despite having come from a Christian background, I wasn't religious myself. But when I saw the discipline that and the love that this Muslim family had in their home because of their faith, I was quite impressed. And I started thinking about faith. This family never imposed their faith on her, but she has, and she has fond memories of them because of that. But she also garnered respect for their faith. She then got moved on, as is often happens, multiple homes. After some time, she found herself in a Nigerian Christian home. And here she says, it was amazing because they got, as a Black family, they understood her hair care, her skin care. And she began to settle down quite nicely there. She was quite fond of them. They were a religious home as well. And she says, I started practicing my Christianity. Um, and that practice has stayed with her ever since. But there were key differences that she says, even despite ethnic, religious, we were a match, but there were differences in cuisine, etc. But we could cope with that. It's time to get moved on, to move on again. And she spoke about it. Now, during her journeys, she was often described as an angry young Black girl whenever she asked for support with her hair needs, skin needs, anything to do, racism in school. Now, while she was telling me all of these stories, she also decided to say, the one home where I was happiest, and she says it was only a short-term placement, was with a white, single female foster carer. She said we had almost nothing in common. I came from a big, huge family. I was Black, I was Christian. This woman was on her own. But she says, she really got me. And I said, why did she really got you? She says, the first day of my placement, she sat me down and she said, I've read through your forms and the records, and I know a lot about you, Rose, but please can you tell me about yourself? Please can you tell me who you are and what you like, and what kind of food you do, you enjoy, and what are your hobbies? Tell me about who you are. And Rose says, despite being in care and having spoken to so many young people, so many carers and so professionals, nobody had ever asked her that, weirdly, and she was moved. And she was able to answer. And she said we had a long conversation. And that conversation sort of became the foundation for her time in that foster carer's home. And the other thing that happened with this foster carer was, they'd have conversations. And a few days later, the foster carer sat her down. She said, look, I've seen you've got this label of somebody who runs away, a runner awayer. And that often happens to children in care. And there've been multiple cases where Rose had run away, whatever reason, police called in, she had the label. And she says, look, wherever you are, whatever time it is, whatever you have done, don't be afraid to give me a call. Just tell me where, and I'll come, I'll get you, we'll have a chat. And that, that the ability that this foster carer had to help Rose talk, and to give Rose the confidence that whatever the circumstances are, I'm here to talk to you. That stayed with Rose. She's now no longer in care. She's a really successful young woman. Among other things, she also works to improve the social care system. But she says, I remember that foster carer because she empowered me in different ways. So coming back to your question then, Anne, it is about, you cannot be expected as a foster carer or as a social worker to understand all the different identities that we have in Britain today. We are a super diverse society. Stuart Hall, whom I quoted earlier, he said that in the 60s, ages ago in the 60s. Now we are even more diverse and complicated and nuanced and textured. So you can't really know everything. But what you can do is be curious and humble and ask the questions. Even if it's a young child, they will have an opinion.
That's really helpful, really helpful. Thank you. And I guess it sort of leads on naturally because you've just mentioned, the thinking sort of more broadly about British society and the diversity within our society. And when you kind of think sort of recently, obviously it's September 24, and it's not been long since obviously we've all seen the kind of, the racism and the violence, that kind of went on. What have you sort of seen an impact on sort of children and young people of kind of witnessing that sort of violence and that racism? Do you have any advice as well, maybe for foster carers or adopters or kinship carers who are caring from children from minoritized groups who maybe, witnessed that and sort of it's impacted them? What are your thoughts about that?
Those riots, when they occurred, they were particularly focused on Muslim communities. Muslim women had stuff thrown at them and all of that. And my husband had a little chat with me because I walk at all sorts of weird hours. I love walking, and he said, darling, few days, don't walk out in the dark. And so there were, I know, communities, not just Muslim, Black communities, South Asian communities who are not all Muslim. Everybody felt a little insecure. There were people saying that since the 70s and the 80s, old timers, grandparents saying, we've never felt like this. We thought all of this was, long lost history now. But I think there are a few things to bear in mind and a few things that can be said to reassure children and young people. If you think about the British Empire, it was super diverse. That was, what, 200 years ago now? Well, okay, 50 years ago, but the empire existed for much longer. And what we see in Britain today is a distillation of all of that diversity and greatness. And so people who are not white, people who are not, we are still in many ways as British as can be. And talking to children and young people about the Black and brown soldiers who fought in World War One and World War Two, and whose graves are still part of, you can be seen in various military and other cemeteries across the world. So there is a responsibility, I think, that carers have, but also educators, to talk about this shared heritage, this shared history. The British Empire and Britain today is not one story. It is complicated, very many stories. So that is one thing I like to talk about. The second thing, I think local authorities, governments, the media, everybody acted decisively. The riots stopped, yes, because of government action and police action, but they also stopped because ordinary people like you and me came out in the streets and said, this is not us. And again, telling children and young people who are probably going to feel, even more insecure because they don't have that biological, buttressing around them, but reassuring them about their place in the society. If you're an unaccompanied asylum seeking child, you're going to feel even, just reassuring them that this was a fringe, this was a minority voice that was dealt with decisively, and that the majority voice came out and said, this is not in our name. And I think the last thing I will say, and this is where I get a little unpopular, the people who were rioting, right? And we must not paint them solely through negative lens. I do not, often they are portrayed as racists and, oh, right, they're racist, they're the baddies, let them go. But actually, these are ordinary working class people who have been denied opportunity, whether it's employment, whether it's education, who are often, relegated to the darker side of town, wherever that is, by successive governments. And I think when we are talking to children and young people, we need to also remind them that these are not all baddies. They're people who are frustrated by consistent lack of access to resource, and people have come and have somehow mobilized them, perhaps around the wrong label. And perhaps, and thinking about all our, what we've been talking about over these last few minutes about texture and labels. So these are people who have been denied resources, and I think the government has a role to play. Researchers have a role to play in listening to their concerns that have perhaps manifested themselves as racist during those riots, but which in some cases are real, they're genuine concerns. How can we have more equitable sharing of resources? I sometimes get raised eyebrows when I say this, but I think in talking to children and young people, we need to try and give them as much information as we possibly can so that they can make up their minds.
I could talk to you all afternoon, I feel, but we will probably have to draw this to a close shortly. So before we do, though, are there any other sort of key messages or key concepts that you think from your research or from your stories of, the stories that you've heard from children and young people that you think it's important that both practitioners and carers kind of hear from you?
I've been doing this work for a few years now, and the most recent research project funded by the Nuffield Foundation called Expressions of Self. We spoke to about 30 children and young people, and we do your whole academic-y thing and your analysis and whatnot, and we came up with a concept called influx identity. Now, we call it influx identity because it's what it says this time on the label. Identity is constantly changing, in flux. It changes in relation to intersectionality. So the layers in children's identities, their faith, their sexuality, their gender. Young men, for example, would have a different experience of religion than young women. So thinking about layers. The second aspect of our influx identities is this whole idea of who's around the child. Peer groups, social workers asking the questions, they're all going to impact on a child's identity so that it's oscillating. You might be Muslim in some context, you might be Black in another context. A young Black woman told us how she code switches. That was her phrase. So she says, when I'm at work, I speak posh English. When I'm with my grandmother, you wouldn't be able to recognize my voice because it's a completely different tone. So that oscillation is really key in thinking about identity. And the last part of influx identity is child determined identities. So what does the child want to be known as? And we've had children who've said, a young lesbian woman said to us, but actually, my lesbianism doesn't matter. My faith matters to me. So I want to be known as a Christian woman. My Blackness doesn't matter to me either because I'm an unaccompanied asylum seeking child. I've come here from a country in Africa. I won't say which one. And there we were all Black. So I don't really think about my Blackness. Another young South Asian woman who had a really dark skin tone. So she was considered Black by her peers. She was in a transracial placement. She was adopted by a white family, and she was the only white person in her town. And she says, I asked her, what is your identity? And she said, my identity is family, because that allowed her a space to capture all these dissonances and convergences. And then there were children and young people who said, I don't want to be known by an ethnic label or a religious label. I don't want to be known as somebody care experience. I want to be known for my potential. I'm going to be I'm going to be the next best-selling author. I'm going to be an artist. Know me for that. So I think to close, I think influx identity, thinking about it through these layers, and creating spaces where you can help children determine who they want to be, but also help children recognize that they can be one thing today and something else tomorrow, and that's fine. In a biological context, that would happen naturally because, in a family, everybody, usually gets these ups and downs and everybody can cope. But for a child in care, the identity is so much more in focus. And we've got all our professional guidelines and whatnot. And we try to conform to those guidelines. But what we often forget is the child needs space. Alina, the young woman who went to Mecca, whom I told you about, she rejected her faith and she still isn't very Muslim. I happened to, in an interview context, meet her foster carer. And the foster carer said to me, Alina was contemplating suicide because of some things that had happened. But she didn't. And she was coming back to live with this foster carer now, which everybody was very pleased about. And she says, I asked Alina, what happened? Alina, why were you? And Alina told her everything. And she said, I was contemplating suicide. But the one thing that held me back is that I know my faith, Islam, or my previous faith, Islam, said suicide is a bad thing. And that prevented her from committing suicide. Now, is it a good thing that faith prescribes something? Sometimes, that's debatable. Is it a good thing that Alina is alive? Yes. So, thinking about all of this, she isn't Muslim anymore, but she remembers that. I asked Alina, what would you like to tell social workers? I'm going to train everybody and do these podcasts with brilliant people like Anne Horne from CoramBAAF. What do you want me to say? And all she said is, tell them, people like me, I still do not know who I am. I am 16. I'm finding out who I am. Give me the space to do so.
I think that is such a powerful place to end on Alina's words, because they are so powerful. I mean, they're literally giving me goosebumps. So I think that is, that's the place to pause, isn't there? I think if, like I said, I could talk to you for hours, and I'm sure others listening now want to know more about, what you've written and your research. Where are the best places that people can go to find more about your work?
On the Coventry University website, there are pages about the project. So if you Google expressions of self, various links will come up. We have also worked with research in practice to provide to create a whole host of open access resources, frontline briefing kits. So all of that's available on their website as well. And if you put expressions of self into YouTube, you will find a little animation we created as well.
Thank you so much for talking to us today, Sariya. It's been a really insightful conversation, and I can't thank you enough. And like I said, I could have talked to you all afternoon, but we probably both need to pause now. So for anybody listening, do remember to take a look at CoramBAAF's website for more information about our Members Week, and any further information around listening to the child, about their identity and plenty more. Just thank you again.
Absolute pleasure, and you were fabulous too. Take care then.
Thank you for listening to this episode of CoramBAAF Conversations. If you'd like to know more or listen to earlier episodes, visit corambaaf.org.uk.